Hi, I'm Jan Henning from FlippedNormals. And today in this podcast episode, we'll be talking about Daz, exactly what Daz is, but also, I think more importantly, the addition of Daz to the FlippedNormals marketplace, which is something that came about, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, something that we're very excited about, and we're excited to see where this sort of goes in the future. But just to start off with, for I think a lot of our audience that may have heard about Daz, just like in the periphery, but never taken the time to explore it. I know that was certainly the case for me a couple of years ago. But Daz is essentially I think the best way to put it is it's a nice introduction to 3D. It's a 3D software with ready-made base meshes where you can pose them. They're rigged. They have nice shapes and everything, nice topology. And then there's this ecosystem around Daz where you can purchase, let's call it accessories. You can purchase clothing, hair, jewelry, whatever you want. But I think a more powerful thing in that sphere is the concept of morphs and additions to characters. You can have a base mesh. For example, Daz, they work primarily right now on two models called Genesis 8 and Genesis 9. And these are just two types of topologies. Genesis 8 came before 9, and Genesis 9 now has some updates. And so you can buy morphs to these characters that transforms them essentially into other characters. With that, you can get very granular, and you can buy an arm pack or a leg pack that enhances just the legs, or an eye pack that just gives you 10 different eyes. And I think it's a nice way of introducing people to 3D without that skill barrier to entry that normal 3D has. Like, you have to get really good in order to produce something that looks just decent, So you work for usually many years before you're actually able to achieve something that looks visually very, very good. And I think that can be a little bit disheartening for people in the beginning. And so if you're not sure if you even want to jump on board when it comes to 3D, I think Daz is an interesting introduction. It allows you to play around with characters. It allows you to play around with lighting and get a feel for what is the world of 3D. That's how I would put it.
Yeah, it's interesting how hard 3D actually is. This is something I keep coming back to time and time again when it comes to, we deal a lot with students, and it takes years before you can actually do something in 3D. And that's kind of when you're studying full-time or if you're working your absolute butt off on your own project. So being able to do something where you can simply jump in and kind of just play with them. For me, Daz is like the digital equivalent of playing with action figures, just where you have a lot bigger selection of things. You can bring in new characters, you can post the characters up, and you can just have fun with that, which is kind of what we're doing in 3D as well. Honestly, when I'm sculpting in ZBrush, I'm playing with my own action figures, so I'm just building them from clay. So it's really cool, but kind of a corollary to that is that if you have like these quote unquote action figures, it means that you have a lot of really cool characters to actually play with in a more serious manner. We made a tutorial some years ago on YouTube where I was showing how to kind of concept with it, where we made a full White Walker character, where we started off in Daz and then took this into ZBrush, sculpted up, kind of did some posing in Daz, brought the meshes back and forth, and it's a really cool way of doing it. Posing in ZBrush kind of sucks, not because it's a bad tool, just because it's not a posing tool, it's not a rigging tool. Well, in Daz, you have the full rigs already set up, like they're really, really detailed rigs, like Morten's saying, for the Genesis models. So it's really cool that you can actually genuinely play around with something like that and change the pose. Posing is something that's always been difficult for 3D artists to do, just because there aren't that many good character rigs for Blender or for Maya that are, not in-house and are actually available. So being able to use a proper character rig, play with poses, if you're doing illustration as well, something like that, or just concept where we need to paint over something, finding the right pose in a reference pack is difficult. So just being able to build your own pose, throw that into Photoshop, throw it into ZBrush, sculpt and paint over it, that's really cool. So it's a really interesting tool if you're doing characters, I would say.
Yeah, I think also for people who are already like our typical audience, who are already into 3D and doing stuff, and maybe have explored ZBrush, Blender, or Maya for a couple of years, I think that's where Daz can be really, really powerful because, like you say, I mean, for me as well, it's when I'm creating a character. Typically, the final stages posing is where I have trouble because, well, I've just sculpted something. I don't have a standardized topology that I can just throw onto a rig and start to work with. But if you think about that from the beginning, and you're like, okay, let's use one of the Genesis models, for example, that's my topology, or transfer your sculpt to one of those topologies. Well, there you go. Now you have a free solution to basically help you pose your character. And then you don't have to get anything set up, right? You don't have to throw it into Blender, find like an auto rig, or in Maya, have like an auto rig that has like decent deformation, because a lot of that's been solved in Daz already. And I think that's where a lot of, let's call it our people, could find strengths in it and use it for their workflows.
Yeah, it's also cool because, like with the aforementioned action figures, if you're concepting up a character and you want to use that for film or games or something, and you want to experiment with costumes or accessories and such, you have to kind of model that. Even if it's just rough, that you take some quick geo and bashing that up, that takes a few minutes. Meaning that in order to iterate on costumes for somebody, it might take like an hour just to get like a few iterations on that, while in Daz you can get pre-made costumes that just wraps to the character. So if you're doing some kind of Hulk character, you want to see him in a suit and some kind of party wear, you can just morph him up into that, and then the suits should just kind of conform to that. So it's genuinely really interesting that you can just kind of just add things to that. So yeah, it's a really interesting, it's a very enjoyable tool to play with like that.
Yeah, I think, if you think about normal character art, where I don't know how many base meshes have been created by artists nowadays, because we all make our own, and none of it's compatible, and everyone makes a rig, and none of that is compatible. So if you buy an asset on a marketplace, let's say fantasy armor or something, well, you have to make that conform to your character before you can even make that work. Whereas with Daz, even though, I'd say that realism is, or real world stuff is where the focus is for a lot of Daz characters. So fantasy might be a bad example, but especially for real world stuff, getting that onto a character, playing around with different costumes, different kinds of clothing is so fast, because there are dedicated, talented artists that spend their time making a pack of like, here's the dress, here's suit pants, here's shirts, and it all works if it's made for the correct Genesis models, which makes iterating over designs so much faster. And you can combine that with the posing, you can combine that with the morphs, and then you can do your own custom things to the base meshes as well if you need something really specific. The same thing goes with their bridges. I'm not entirely sure of all the bridges that Daz has, but it does allow you to easily export in and out of Daz with like ZBrush and Unreal, I believe. But I think there are others. I'm not fully aware of that.
There is one for Blender as well.
Ah, okay, yeah.
I used that a little bit.
That makes it really quick, right? To get in and out. Is it like what is it called?
It's kind of like GoZ.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking of.
Yeah, so you can, I haven't used the other ones, I used the Blender one, it's been some years now, but essentially you click a button and your asset is transferred into the software, and you can click a button and it goes back again, as far as I remember.
Right. Yeah, okay. The only thing is, like, when I've spoken to people who use Daz on a regular basis, it's like they all kind of say the same thing. They do think it's a little bit clunky to work with. I think maybe it's like it hasn't really caught up to today's standards of what a 3D software is supposed to be able to do and how it functions. But I think that's also just because it is more aimed generally at hobbyists, right? And so the same requirements that professional CG artists might have wouldn't typically apply to that software.
It's very different building a tool for hobbyists who want to play around with 3D versus somebody who needs a certain feature, otherwise the pipeline is going to break and Captain America won't make the movies, right? It's a bit more critical that you have like good Python or API support or something like that.
Yeah.
For tools like Maya, Houdini.
And then that sort of segues into the thing that I'm the most excited about is that we now have full support for Daz on FlippedNormals. And before you were able to upload Daz models to FlippedNormals because Daz was a software category that you could pick. But after speaking to people who worked with Daz and looking at the other marketplaces, I think it became clear that Daz is a separate entity within 3D. I mean, sure, there's some overlap because the people who create really high quality Daz models use the other professional 3D software in order to create really nice Daz models. So they'll use ZBrush for sculpting up their characters. They'll use Substance for their textures. They use Marvelous Designer for the clothing. So there is a lot of overlap when you create. But the general user base for Daz tends to be more of the hobbyist nature. People who either are getting into 3D, who just want to play around with it. I would say it's like the majority of what I see. And so we actually decided to separate it out on the marketplace. So right now we have a tutorials, an asset, and a Daz sort of main menu item. And that was very intentional. And that allowed us to get a lot more granular with the category and the filtering, specifically the filtering for Daz. I think as we explored it more, it just became clear that, well, if you wanted to find a Daz model for Genesis 8 and you also, okay, I just want to look at, I don't know, a category for sportswear or something like that, that was impossible to do with our current category system. And so right now, I guess it is kind of an experiment to see where this goes on FlippedNormals. But it's something that I'm really excited about adding because I think it can add a lot of value for both the Daz community, but also for the 3D community at large, for people looking to expand their skills.
Yeah, I'm very excited to get more Daz creators onto FlippedNormals. Want to just welcome the Daz community. Oh
yeah, I think we haven't really made we've made an announcement that it's there, but something I want to host like a welcome sale soon for Daz on FlippedNormals.
Yeah,
I think we're up to 200 products now, and I think we have something like 35 creators. I think roughly last time I looked. But there's a lot of products within Daz as well, so it's about managing sort of what goes on to the marketplace. I think from speaking to a lot of the other artists, one of the things that I realized is that FlippedNormals, I think, could be the perfect place for Daz because of our curated nature and sort of continuing that with Daz as well. Because we saw that in the beginning as well, even though curation was like a necessity for FlippedNormals in the beginning because we couldn't handle that influx of products, right? Curation on FlippedNormals became something we had to do and we've continued to do, and I think that works very well for us. I think doing that for Daz is gonna help that community as well because it means that people will know, okay, we can go to FlippedNormals to get really high quality products that meet our standards and expectations, and it's something that we can be proud of to present as well. Then we can look through the library and be like, okay, actually I want to use that as well and test that out.
Yeah, very, very interesting. We take curation very seriously. It's something we've been doing since absolutely day one. We just go through and make sure that every creator is proper for the marketplace. Their products are presented well, and that the products are just of high quality. The reason for it is honestly quite simple. It's just because you need to know that the stuff you're buying is proper. So yeah, we're gonna take our curated approach seriously and continue that as we are doing currently, continuing that with the Daz expansion as well.
It's been interesting communicating with people from the Daz community because unlike when I've spoken to other artists within our regular community. And, we have the same thing. It's like there's a lot of attachment to our work, and egos fly high sometimes. That was one of the things that surprised me. Everyone that I've spoken to, Daz-wise, has been like so welcoming and really open to cooperation and changing their presentation, and making sure that they have the sort of best visual presentation they can on FlippedNormals. It's always a little bit uncertain, what's going to happen there. I remember like when we started looking more into Blender as well, we were definitely hit with this is a different type of community than we were used to, and which is always fun. The Blender community is always fun to poke fun of because it gets so serious.
You would never.
But obviously, Blender is a huge part of what we do now. I mean, Blender is pretty much the only, let's call it, main 3D software that I use nowadays. That alongside ZBrush and occasionally Substance. But Blender is like my main go-to for anything, really. If it's presentation, modeling, shading, whatever, except for sculpting and texturing. It's not great there. Sculpting has gotten better, but yeah, there's always things missing, I feel like. But anyway, back to Daz. So one of the things that I wanted to clarify as well for people is that I looked at Daz as sort of a pure hobbyist tool in the beginning. And, one of the things that I think we should clarify as well, which is something that we spoke to Taffy about, the creators or the ones who own Daz in the beginning as well, years ago, was that there's a lot of explicit content when it comes to Daz. And I think the separation on the marketplace helps that as well. One thing is just pure filtering and categorization, but the explicit nature of some of the Daz content, I think, it lends itself well to those being separate. I mean, it still exists on the same marketplace, so you can still browse all the content. It just ensures that, if you're at work browsing and there's some explicit content popping up, you're not going to be viewing that on your screen. So I think that was a good suggestion. And we'll definitely keep that. But in terms of like the hobbyist nature of the people who use Daz, I think that's why I dismissed it in the beginning. And it was sort of like the same thing with maybe Poser. And I think sort of Daz took over from Poser. I never looked into it really because I saw there was a lot of explicit content. I was like, okay, so people just make that. I'm not interested in that. I'll just, let me try ZBrush. And I think I kind of missed out a little bit because it could have really helped me in many cases when making a character. So that's something that, now I'm aware of it. So I'm really glad. And I get to play around with it and test stuff.
Yeah, it's like I mentioned before, it's 3D has a hell of a barrier to get into. So if you want to play with characters and have fun with that, yeah, you can use ZBrush. But it's if your main thing is you want to just have fun with characters, then using pre-made assets like with Daz is such an interesting way to be creative without needing to spend like 500 hours learning sculpting and ZBrush just to get your foot in the door.
But also, just from a money point of view, like if you're just getting started maybe or thinking about getting started, I know there are a lot of people who are more apprehensive nowadays because of AI. And so like committing that time and committing money to a piece of software where you're like, is this a career path for me? Is this something I want to do? I think, a combination of Daz and Blender is great there because it's two free alternatives that are both really powerful in like different regards, but it could be a good foot in the door for people who might be thinking about getting into 3D, but don't necessarily want to make that crazy money investment that you typically have to do to get some of the more powerful software.
Yeah, I guess just a note there though. While it's free, it's not open source like Blender is, so it's still a closed source software.
Yeah. There was something I spoke to someone about some of the features for Daz, where it's like, the hair, I think it's called D-Force, or maybe that's the clothing actually. So let's just scratch the D-Force name, but at least the hair. There are certain Daz artists that get access to that tool to be able to create hair, whereas like the rest of us, we have to, do geometry hair. So I think the real hair, like simulated hair or whatever, is only sold through Daz themselves or something like that.
Oh, that's interesting.
I think and I guess that's one of the annoying things about it not being like open source like Blender is that companies can put on these restrictions, and so you wouldn't be able to get access to it. I don't actually know what that looks like in practice though. So like if you wanted to, I guess it's like if you wanted to create hair like that, you probably can't unless you're you have an approved license from Daz or something.
Yeah, that's interesting.
But it's, I mean, there's a lot of possibilities with Daz there for sure. I was really surprised by just the general amount of assets available in all categories, and especially the clothing stuff. That really took me by surprise because there's a lot of really high detail, high quality clothing there. And in the beginning, I wasn't quite sure what was going on, but then I figured out people were using Marvelous to create clothing, and that's how they were able to achieve like really nice results, which was really cool to see.
Clothing is such a hard thing to make in 3D. It's like, oh, you're making a character, you learn how to sculpt that, and then you want to just give it like a t-shirt. Cool. Learn Marvelous, become a tailor. It's such a barrier for something that it's not a small thing, because costume design is obviously massive, but often we kind of think of clothing as like, we just like put on some clothing at the end, but really it's not. So having like packs like this is so useful.
I remember in the beginning when I was getting into Marvelous as well, it's like back then it was like Marvelous was getting more and more used in production, but it wasn't like a big thing. And so going and looking up and finding patterns for clothing was really hard. And like I found like obscure like book resources from like Romania where they're like, okay, this is a great pattern book. Okay, I'll get that just to learn about it, because I'm not a seamstress or tailor, so I don't have that education. That was really tricky. Well, with all that being said, I'm really excited to welcome the Daz community onto FlippedNormals, and I'm excited to look into content creation for Daz as well. For me, that involves getting more into Daz and learning more about Daz, and that's going to be a journey. And I know there's some really great resources on YouTube for that. I've been recommended some by people in the community. But yeah, I think something that we're interested in as well is expanding the FlippedNormals library as well. Start creating some Daz content to see if we're able to create something that's of use to people. We've talked about converting some of our kits to Daz, making that usable in Daz, but maybe in the future as well, creating some dedicated Daz characters as well. That's definitely something that I could see be really fun. In the beginning, it would probably be, taking a Genesis 8 or 9 model and creating a specific FlippedNormals one. But, if we see that becoming popular, we could also look at maybe creating our own base mesh that you could use in Daz. So I don't know, the future can hold a lot of interesting things for Daz, but we'll have to see, I guess.
Yes, if you guys have any suggestions, what you guys want to see, just let us know. And we're still fresh to this, so we were open to all sorts of ideas at this point.
All right, thank you guys so much, and we'll see you later.